Hi, this is Leonard for Kosmic, and today we're here talking to you about a new synth from Behringer, and it's a recreation of the vintage ARP Odyssey. Now, Behringer have been making quite a few vintage recreations in recent years, and I got to say this one's very special. So let's just take a look at the build of it first. The first thing you'd notice is it's built like an absolute tank. The entire chassis is metal. It's full size as well, so the trend has been with a lot of these vintage recreations that they've been shrunk down to 3/4 or half size, or like the Roland Boutiques, they're tiny little versions. Well, this is full size. We've got a full size key bed, they're semi-weighted keys, they feel wonderful, everything's built exactly as you want. As I said, it's built like a tank. It's very heavy. That's probably the only thing to be aware of if you're planning on touring with it or gigging with it. But other than that, this is an absolutely fantastic synth. So before we actually get started on using it, let's first of all just take a look at what we've got on here. And first of all, I'm going to show you what's on the back. Alright, so let's just run through what we've got happening on the back of the synth here. So first of all, of course, your power connection, power button. Probably one of the more noticeable things about this synth is the LEDs that we've got on top of every control. So we have a dedicated knob here to actually control the brightness of it, because turned up full they are very bright, and in a dark room they can actually be a little bit overwhelming. So being able to turn them down is extremely useful. Next thing over, we've got MIDI, so you've either got your 5-pin MIDI or USB MIDI, and that'll send MIDI in out as well over USB. Then we've got a couple of pedal connections here, and they're used to control various things on the synth. It's not traditional sustain pedal, they're used for different functions, and there are switches and faders related to that as well. Then we actually have two outputs on here. This is a mono synth, so these actually output exactly the same thing. We've just got a low level and a high level output. There's an external audio input as well, so you can run any audio into there and it will play back when either you've got a key depressed or you're playing back from the sequencer. You've got headphones here as well with an independent control, and then finally over here we've got some CV inputs and outputs, which can be used if you want to hook this up to a modular setup. Okay, so let's take a look at how this all works. Now, there is something I really want to impress upon you with this, which is if you're looking to buy a synth, especially if you're looking to buy your first synth, something like this may seem a little bit intimidating. It's fully analog, there are no presets, the only things you have to make sounds are these controls that you can see on the panel. Really the only screen control you have here is for the effects that are built in, but everything else has to be done manually, and it can be quite intimidating. So I really want to impress upon you here that this is actually quite a simple way of making sounds. It is actually very logical once you understand how it's laid out, and for me there's a lot more satisfaction in actually building your own sound than there is in just running through some presets and finding something that might vaguely fit what you're doing. It's much more fun to actually build the perfect sound for what you're trying to do, or indeed to just discover a sound that you might build a track around. So let's run through how this all works. So first of all, this is a 2 oscillator synthesizer. So you've got oscillator 1 and 2 here. They're independently tuned, so there is no master tune on this synth. You actually have your coarse and fine tune here, and if you wanted to retune the synth and say put it in fifths or octaves, then you'd actually have to manually do that from here. There's no octave switches or anything. Below that, we've got some frequency modulation options. So what I'm going to do actually before we get into that, in the mixer section over here, I'm just going to bring up oscillator 1 so we can hear what we've got going on. So that's the volume fader for oscillator 1, and we've got oscillator 2 as well, but we'll just stick with 1 for the moment. Okay, so we've got some sound there. Now, if you want to play the keyboard, that's pretty easy to do. You've got a switch here that turns that on and off. And we've got octave switches here as well, so if you can hear it up high. That's as high as you can get it. And of course, where you're really going to probably use it is in the down position. Okay, so let's have a look at how we might affect this sound. So the first thing we can do is over on this audio mixer channel, we've got a choice between a saw wave or a square wave. So as you can hear, they're really fat as well. For making bass lines, this thing will be absolutely amazing. Let's move over to this side again. So as I mentioned, the tuning knobs, I'm not going to play with those because I've actually tuned this synth and I don't want to ruin my tuning. We've got a couple of things we can do down the bottom here. We've got some frequency modulation. So you've got 2 faders for this and you've got 2 options per fader. So we can modulate with either LFO in the sine position or square position shapes, that is, or we've got a second fader where we can use the ADSR envelope over here or sample and hold, which we have over here, which we'll come to a little bit later as well. And then next to that we've got some pulse width modulation options for when you're in square mode. So we've got manual pulse width, and then we've got a modulation fader here as well, which can be controlled either through the LFO or through the ADSR envelope. So let's just have a listen to what we can do with that. So that's our straight saw wave. Now, if I'm just going to set the LFO, you've got a flashing light here that'll show you how fast the LFO is moving. There is no sync on this as well. There's no tempo sync. Everything is done, I suppose, fluidically. We've got a tempo fader over here, but there's no sync to that as well. You would just move it till it feels right. Indeed, if you were connecting this with MIDI, then of course you can sync it to your DAW via MIDI. All right, so let's get some modulation going. So I'm going to set my FM to the sine wave and just bring a little bit of this in. Now this is perfect if you make synth wave ready, like, you know, the 80s thing that's going on at the moment is perfect for that sort of thing. We'll just tune that in a little bit. And this would be good if we put this up into the higher octave. And what we're going to do as well is just adjust this envelope a little bit. So I'm sure most of you probably know, if you're watching this video, how to use an ADSR envelope. We've got our 4 stages here. I won't go into this because we don't want to be here all day. So I'm just going to add a little bit of attack. And I'm also going to add some release time to this as well. Now we probably do we do lose a bit here from the fact that this is, well, with one oscillator we're just talking monophonic. If I add the second oscillator, then we get a duophonic synth, and I'll show you that a bit later on as well. Maybe let's just see what else we could do to that before we try anything else. So let's say I flick this over to the square wave, right? So now I could add some pulse width modulation, so that's manual. And I can also add it with the LFO as well. Probably quite subtle, but turn it off, you'll hear it. If I turn this down, you definitely hear it. Right, we can do that with the envelope as well. Probably not as useful. You mostly do this with the and this is how you could get some cool sounding bass lines as well if you filter down. If you're into drum and bass, this is kind of the perfect. Okay, like so. So that's really all the controls you have per oscillator. One thing I will do now is maybe just jump into the effects with that, because there's another cool thing we could do with that. If I get the patch back that I had before, we just add a little bit of warble in it. What'll really set that off is maybe having some delay or reverb on it. So right now I've got a delay set up. The effects are actually really easy to use. You can cycle through them. There's over 30 in here, so you can see there's a whole heap of them in there. If we just go back to the beginning here, just find a reverb. Maybe let's just try a plate for now. So you select that, you just scroll the thing, select it. This is a push button encoder. And then you've got 3 parameters you can control. So if you want to control the decay time, it's that there. We can hit again, we get pre-delay, and if we hit the third one, we get some damping. Okay, so that's just using one oscillator and an effect, and we've already got an amazing sound with that. So you can see how great this synth is. If we have a look at the second oscillator, then that operates exactly the same way. The only thing that's different is that we have a sync option on here. So let's bring in that second oscillator. So same features on the mixer. You know, you've just got this sort of oscillator 1 and 2 control, so we can blend them together, we can play them together. Now if I go down to the lower octaves, if I was to detune this one a little bit, so we can get big detuned basses out of it as well, or leads. So the tuning knobs are very sensitive, so that might sound cool with a bit of chorus or something on it as well, just to really set that off. I'll just briefly show you sync mode as well. So there we go. I won't go too much into explaining that, but essentially if the waveforms are at different phases, then it'll just reset every time the first oscillator hits the beginning of its phase again. So that's that as it is. If we turn sync mode off, now we're out of tune. Back in tune. Okay, so that's the two oscillators. The modulation options work exactly the same on the second oscillator. If we move over to this modulation section in the middle, these are the things we can use to route to various things to actually create modulation. So we've got the low frequency oscillator, which I've already showed you. That automatically outputs a sine wave and a square wave, and wherever the option is to use it, you'll have a switch that will allow you to use either the sine or the square. If I was to do that, say this is what I showed you initially. Using it in the saw mode, so that's dramatic version of it. If I put it in square mode, what we'll get is kind of a cutting effect, like so. All right. Okay, so that's the low frequency oscillator. The other thing we've got is sample and hold, which is actually probably one of my favorite ways of modulating things. For those of you who don't know, sample and hold, all it does is it's a thing which will sample a random frequency, and then you can use that to control something else. It might be the pitch, it might be the filter position, you know, could be anything. So let's just check out how that works. So most commonly the way you do that is you'd use noise as what we're going to sample. So I'm going to push up the noise fader. I've also got the option here to use the two oscillators as well, which you can experiment with. You know, there's a lot of fun in that as well. And if I was to do this to the oscillator pitch, so right now I'm using LFO trigger, so every time the LFO begins a new phase, it'll sample a new frequency from the noise and then apply that to the pitch. And if I increase the speed of the LFO, so that's sample and hold. We can use that for the filter as well, which I'll come to now. So over to the filter section, we've got a few things on here. So the filter at the very top, then we've got the audio mixer below, and we've also got some modulation options for the filter. We have the high pass filter on here as well. We've got a VCA fader, and now that one's pretty self-explanatory. All that does is just turn up the volume of the synth and bypasses the envelope, or the keyboard, so that it'll sound whatever the last played pitch is. We've also got this drive switch. Now I can't see any reason why you would ever turn that off. If you turn it off, it's very quiet. It's a lot more beefy when it's turned on. I really don't know that you'd ever not use that. Now the filter is probably, for me, the coolest part of this synth, because it has three modes. There are three versions or iterations of the original ARP Odyssey, and therefore there are three different filter designs, and this synth actually contains all three of those designs. So if we were to run through them, the first thing you've got is a two-pole filter. So this is probably the beefiest one. Being that it's only a two-pole filter, we still get quite a lot of meatiness to it. And the resonance as well is pretty cool, because you'd expect normally from a resonance knob or a fader on a synth filter that it would actually kill a bit of the low end when you crank it right up. on this 2-pole setting, you actually don't really lose much. You're just going to get that real strong resonance when we push up into the self-oscillation area, which is right at the top. And interestingly, probably again, one of my favorite things about this filter is that all 3 modes will self-oscillate. You can actually play the filter with no oscillators at all. Being fully analog, of course, we're not going to have to deal with stepping like we will with digital filters. So the other 2 are 4-pole filters. So you will hear that because the filter slope is much steeper with this, we do lose a lot of the signal when the resonance is up high. And the same thing when we just move the filter without any resonance, is a steeper cut. Then the 3rd one has probably the most aggressive self-resonance. Actually, that one is actually quite a bit louder. I don't know, there's something crunchy about that 3rd one. And we'll also come to how we could modulate that. So I'll come back to the mixer last. On the very right, we've got 2 envelope generators. We've got a really simple attack-release envelope. These are pretty rare nowadays, you don't see a lot of those. And then below that we've got your normal ADSR envelope, which is what you'd expect. So why do they put both of them on there? Well, if you're going to use your ADSR for something, you might have this set in a particular way for your filter modulation, and then you might want to have a simpler envelope for using on your VCA. So that sort of thing, you've got 2 different options you can use. So finally on here, before we get to the things that Behringer have added that weren't part of the initial original synth, we've got the mixer section. So first of all, I've already showed you the 2 oscillators. Let's just turn this back down. So this is probably a good time to mention as well that this is a duophonic synth. So when you actually have both faders turned up, you can play 2 notes at the same time. It doesn't sound like using a polysynth. It's not quite as useful as that. So you can hear it's a little bit strange, but you can play 2 notes at the same time, so you do have that ability in there. If you play, you've got a portamento fader over here as well, so it takes a little bit of getting used to, but you can do some cool things with that. Alright, so finally let's just deal with this audio mixer. We've got the 2 faders there for the oscillators. We've also got a 3rd one here, and this is for either noise or ring modulation. So we've got 2 types of noise. We've got pink noise and white noise. And if I bring some of this up, it's very cool if you actually have resonance turned right up. If we turn these down, so if you want to make cool sound effects, then it's perfect. A bit of noise and some self-oscillation and you're set. Then we've also got a couple of modulation options for the filter. So we've got, we can either use the keyboard position, so the higher you are up on the keyboard, the more the filter will open. We've also got the sample and hold mixer or pedal, which is the pedal input I showed you on the back. Then we've got your normal sample and hold or LFO, so this one is probably, so that's on LFO mode at the moment. That by default will use the sine output of the LFO, you can't use the square. And then we've got so that's the noise. I'll show you some cool tricks with the noise a little bit later as well. And we move to the ring modulation. So ring modulation is where we multiply one source by another, in this case 2 oscillators. So you can play this without any of the oscillators being up. Whoops, let's just turn off the sample and hold on the filter, get the resonance turned down. And if you change the frequency of one of the oscillators, you can get this sort of effect. Now you can mix that in with the pure signal of those oscillators as well. if you wanted to, and we get this gigantic sound. So again, perfect if you make drum and bass or anything that uses heavy bass lines. Okay, so we've gone through all those. Maybe let's just take a look now at some cool tricks we can do. Oh, the final thing I should mention as well is there's no modulation options for the high pass filter. That's just something you can chuck on there if you want to just lose some of the low frequencies. It's a very transparent filter, so you do actually have to push it up quite high. It's not really going to kill your entire signal. So you can see how high up I am here now, and we still do have like quite a lot of low mids in that signal. But as you can see, there's a lot more bass in there. So if you're making bass lines, probably don't use that. You'd use that more if you were using this for lead sounds, or I guess, you know, lighter elements on top. Okay, so the next thing we want to talk about are the things that Behringer have added to this synth that weren't part of the original design. First of all, we already had a brief look at how the effects work, so I'll just sort of run through them. You can see we've got a lot of different reverbs, there's gated ones, reverse. There's a couple of delays as well, so they're probably something I would personally use a lot, especially if we were making sort of arpeggiated patterns or anything kind of with shorter decay times. We've also got, so there's more reverbs there. We've got chorus as well, and there's one a bit later on that I really like. Some of these pitch ones are cool, so if we just and we can choose where this goes. So if we set this to 7, we get fifths. And that's useful as well because we don't actually have to retune an oscillator to do that, which on this synth is a bit of a pain because there aren't any reference points. So if you move that frequency, you know, out of position, you've got to retune it. Yeah, this one here, so delay and chorus, this is probably the one I found to be very useful. Now you'd use this if you were probably not doing bass lines. So it sounds good on something like that, but it's even better if we were to adjust this envelope and we got something a little bit more. So we get a bit of delay on there. This is probably a really good time to talk about the sequencer and arpeggiator section. So this is the other thing they've added that's brand new. This is probably the biggest thing, to be honest. So we've got two things we can do here. We have a sequencer built in, and we have an arpeggiator. So if I turn on the ARP, very easy, there's an ARP switch. I can play an ARP. The other thing I find with this synth as well, the envelope's nice and tight, so you can actually get some quite short, ticky sounds out of this. Now, especially if I was to actually apply a little bit of this to the filter as well. So I'm just going to turn the filter frequency down and then add some filter modulation with ASDR. It's maybe a little bit too much. So you can hear the delay tail on that as well. This would also be a good time to mention the way that this is synced. Now, there is no tempo sync in this synth at all. You can set a BPM in some of the effects, but in terms of how that interfaces with the rest of the synth is actually quite meaningless because there's no tempo setting for the synth. All you have here is this tempo fader. So when I do this, And you can hear that the delay is actually not coming with it as well. So you'd actually have to, if you were to change the speed, you'd probably have to go back in, have a look at your delay settings, and adjust them so that they fit with the tempo that you've set for the ARP. Finally, there's a built-in sequencer. I'm not going to go into how we program all that because it takes quite a while, but I can tell you there are 8 banks, there are 8 patches within each bank, and there are 2 different ways that you can program it. There's a keyboard mode, which is quite simple, so each step highlights, you press a key and it moves on to the next step, and the second way is to do it as a step-based process. Which is very similar to the keyboard, except that it doesn't automatically move on to the next step. So you'd program a note into one step, and then you have all the options of adding your, whether you were to use a rest or an accent or anything like that. You do all that before you manually move over to the next step. I will just play you back something that's programmed in here already. So you can instantly hear that my delay's out of time. We can sort of play with that a little bit, so tempo here. Really all you're doing is just looking for something that sounds good, unless you actually really wanted to sit there and get your BPM counter out and figure it out. So from here we can just have a bit of a play with it and see what kind of sounds we can get out of this. So you'll hear, if you're making trance or melodic techno, perfect for that. I've already showed you can make big fat bass lines out of this if you're doing any sort of bass heavy genres. If we change the filter mode, we'll get different sounds out of this as well. Now, I'll show you some cool things we can do without the oscillators. So we've got nothing playing right now. All I'm going to do is put the filter into self-oscillation. We'll instantly get this effect. I can use the keyboard effect. So what we're actually doing now is essentially playing the filter with the keyboard. So you can hear it's actually following the pattern of this ARP. Right. The other thing we could do now is maybe introduce some LFO modulation on this. So we're getting this effect. Now if I play with the pitch or the frequency of the LFO, really cool things happen. Right, and then we can do this sort of thing. Turn the keyboard down. Turn up the speed of the pattern. So the 2-pole. So for me, this is actually an amazing synth for making effects as well. You can really use it for anything. The only thing that you couldn't use it for would be probably, well, obviously it's not a polysynth, so for making pads, probably not the synth for that, but basses, leads, ARPs, effects, has everything you would ever need on a synth to make any of those sounds. It's real analog. It has no presets, so it encourages you to experiment and get in there and make your own sounds. And I don't think there's much more you can ask from a synth than that. As you can tell probably from the way I've been talking in this video, I really love this synth. And of course I can't tell you to buy it, I have to stop short of that, but I do want to say if you're in the market for a synth, you must have a look at this. The other thing I really do want to hone in on is that if you're starting out, if you're looking to buy your first synth, please do not be intimidated by something like this. As I've shown you, it's actually relatively easy to use once you get your head around it, and the results you get from it will be, in my mind, much better than what you'll get from just buying a basic digital synth, something already loaded with a bunch of sounds. You'll get a lot more satisfaction, and you'll get a much purer sound from something like this than you will from anything else. So if you want to know more, please come and see us in store, or you can check us out online at kosmic.com.au.